Chapter 3 of The Wrong Box. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Wrong Box by Robert Louis Stevenson and Lloyd Osborne. Chapter 3. The Lecturer at Large. Whether mankind is really partial to happiness is an open question. Not a month passes by but some cherished son runs off into the merchant service, or some valued husband decamps to Texas with a lady help. Clergymen have fled from their parishioners, and even judges have been known to retire. To an open mind it will appear, upon the whole, less strange that Joseph Finsbury should have been led to entertain ideas of escape. His lot, I think we may say, was not a happy one. My friend Mr. Morris, with whom I travel up twice or thrice a week from Snaresbrook Park, is certainly a gentleman whom I esteem, but he was scarce a model nephew. As for John, he is of course an excellent fellow, but if he was the only link that bound one to a home, I think the most of us would vote for foreign travel. In the case of Joseph, John, if he were a link at all, was not the only one. Endearing bonds had long enchained the old gentleman to Bloomsbury, and by these expressions I do not in the least refer to Julia Hazeltine, of whom, however, he was fond enough, but to that collection of manuscript note-books in which his life lay buried. That he should ever have made up his mind to separate himself from these collections and go forth upon the world with no other resources than his memory supplied, is a circumstance highly pathetic in itself, and but little creditable to the wisdom of his nephews. The design, or at least the temptation, was already some months old, and when a bill for £800, payable to himself, was suddenly placed in Joseph's hand, it brought matters to an issue. He retained that bill, which to one of his frugality meant wealth, and he promised himself to disappear among the crowds at Waterloo, or, if that should prove impossible, to slink out of the house in the course of the evening, and melt like a dream into the millions of London. By a peculiar interposition of Providence and railway mismanagement, he had not so long to wait. He was one of the first to come to himself and scramble to his feet after the Browndean catastrophe, and he had no sooner remarked his prostrate nephews than he understood his opportunity and fled. A man upwards of 70, who has just met with a railway accident, and who is cumbered besides with the full uniform of Sir Faraday Bond, is not very likely to flee far. But the wood was close at hand, and offered the fugitive at least a temporary cover. Hither then the old gentleman skipped with extraordinary expedition, and being somewhat winded and a good deal shaken, here he lay down in a convenient grove, and was presently overwhelmed by slumber. The way of fate is often highly entertaining to the looker on, and it is certainly a pleasant circumstance that while Morris and John were delving in the sand to conceal the body of a total stranger, their uncle lay in dreamless sleep a few hundred yards deeper in the wood. He was awakened by the jolly note of a bugle from the neighbouring high road, where a char a banc was bowling by with some belated tourists. The sound cheered his old heart. It directed his steps into the bargain, and soon he was on the highway, looking east and west from under his visor, and doubtfully revolving what he ought to do. A deliberate sound of wheels arose in the distance, and then a cart was seen approaching, well filled with parcels, driven by a good-natured looking man on a double bench, and displaying on a board the legend, "I. Chandler, Carrier." In the infamously prosaic mind of Mr. Finsbury, certain streaks of poetry survived, and were still efficient. They had carried him to Asia Minor as a giddy youth of 40, and now, in the first hours of his recovered freedom, they suggested to him the idea of continuing his flight in Mr. Chandler's cart. It would be cheap, properly broached, might even cost nothing, and after years of mittens and hygienic flannel, his heart leapt out to meet the notion of exposure. Mr. Chandler was perhaps a little puzzled to find so old a gentleman so strangely clothed, and begging for a lift on so retired a roadside; but he was a good-natured man, glad to do us service, and so he took the stranger up. and he had his own ideas of civility, and so he asked no questions. Silence, in fact, was quite good enough for Mr. Chandler, but the cart had scarcely begun to move forward ere he found himself involved in a one-sided conversation.
"I can see,"
began Mr. Finsbury,
"by the mixture of parcels and boxes that are contained in your cart, each marked with its individual label, and by the good Flemish mare you drive, that you occupy the post of carrier in that great English system of transport which, with all its defects, is the pride of our country."
"Yes, sir," returned Mr. Chandler vaguely, for he hardly knew what to reply. "Them parcel posts have done us carriers a world of harm."
"I am not a prejudiced man,"
continued Joseph Finsbury.
"As a young man I travelled much. Nothing was too small or too obscure for me to acquire. At sea I studied seamanship, learned the complicated knots employed by mariners, and acquired the technical terms. At Naples I would learn the art of making macaroni; at Nice the principles of making candied fruit. I never went to the opera without first buying the book of the piece, and making myself acquainted with the principal airs by picking them out on the piano with one finger."
"You must have seen a deal, sir," remarked the carrier, touching up his horse. "I wish I could have had your advantages."
"Do you know how often the word whip occurs in the Old Testament?" continued the old gentleman. 100 and, if I remember exactly, 47 times.
"Do it indeed, sir?" said Mr. Chandler. "I should never have thought it."
The Bible contains 3,501,249 letters. Of verses, I believe there are upwards of 18,000. There have been many editions of the Bible. Wycliffe was the first to introduce it into England about the year 1300. The Paragraph Bible, as it is called, is a well-known edition, and is so called because it is divided into paragraphs. The Breeches Bible is another well-known instance, and gets its name either because it was printed by one Breeches, or because the place of publication bore that name.
The carrier remarked drily that he thought that was only natural, and turned his attention to the more congenial task of passing a cart of hay. It was a matter of some difficulty, for the road was narrow, and there was a ditch on either hand.
"I perceive,"
began Mr. Finsbury, when they had successfully passed the cart,
"that you hold your reins with one hand. You should employ two."
"Well, I like that," cried the carrier contemptuously. "Why?"
"You do not understand," continued Mr. Finsbury. "What I tell you is scientific fact, and reposes on the theory of the lever, a branch of mechanics. There are some very interesting little shilling books upon the field of study, which I should think a man in your station would take a pleasure to read. But I am afraid you have not cultivated the art of observation. At least we have now driven together for some time, and I cannot remember that you have contributed a single fact. This is very false principle, my good man. For instance, I do not know if you observed that, as you passed the hay cart man, you took your left." "Of course I did," cried the carrier, who was now getting belligerent. "He'd have had the law on me if I hadn't." "In France now, and also, I believe, in the United States of America, you would have taken the right," resumed the old man. "I would not," cried Mr. Chandler indignantly. "I would have taken the left." "I observe again," continued Mr. Finsbury, scorning to reply, "that you mend the dilapidated parts of your harness with string. I have always protested against this carelessness and slovenliness of the English poor. In an essay that I once read before an appreciative audience—" "'Tain't string," said the carrier sullenly. "It's packthread." "I have always protested," resumed the old man, "that in their private and domestic life, as well as in their labouring career, the lower classes of this country are improvident, thriftless, and extravagant. A stitch in time—" "Who the devil are the lower classes?"